All right, so moving into our actual analysis of countries, the first thing that we're going to look at here is the first country we're moving into is Britain. And what we're going to be looking at today are some of the things that where their sovereignty comes from, where the authority of their rulers come from, and how power is exercised throughout the country. All right, so the first thing that we've got to look at with England or the Great Britain is we've got to look at this idea of legitimacy. The legitimacy of Great Britain has developed gradually over the last few centuries. Britain was originally based upon a traditional legitimacy with a hereditary ruling family. So we look at that. We look at the history of kings and queens throughout England. We look at some of the feudal concepts that they had, where you had your peasants and you had your lords and you had your kings and queens and nobility and things like that. So as we see throughout the history of Great Britain, it moves on. The king gradually loses power. Parliament gradually gains power. And this leads to very slow but very stable change. So when we look at the history of England, except for a few turbulent time periods and things like that, England is a very stable country for a very, very, very long time. All right, so it's definitely originally based upon that traditional legitimacy, that concept of the divine right theory, and that's why the ruler was in power. Britain currently runs on a democracy. Most citizens accept that there's a connection between the church and state within that democracy. So when we think about the United States, where there's very much supposed to be a hard line between church and state, and to ensure that there is this complete and absolute division, there is an official religion in Great Britain. It's the Church of England. It is a Protestant version of Christianity. And most people are very aware of the fact, and they're very okay with the fact that there is an intermingling of those concepts. Even with that intermingling, Great Britain's government tends to be very, very secular. So there's not a whole bunch of concepts where there's a hard-line religious idea to how laws need to be passed, as we will later see with Iran. Britain finds its legitimacy through custom, common law, and important documents. We refer to that, and we've talked about it, different concepts and things like that, but rather than it being a lot of code law, we talk about that as being common law. So lots of tradition, lots of things in the past. What we refer to all of these things, the custom, the common law, and the important documents together, we refer to that as the Constitution of the Crown. So there is no formal written constitution in Britain. So one of the things that we have to understand about democracies is that a constitution is not required in order for something to be a democracy. And Great Britain is a great example of that. They use their custom, their common law, and important documents like the Magna Carta, like the Petition of Right, like different documents like that, to be able to establish how the country is supposed to run, but there is no formal overriding constitution like we're used to in the United States. So let's look at some of those important documents that eventually lead up to this idea of the Constitution of the Crown. Britain's political system is now based upon a rational legal authority, and the documents and concepts below help to establish that authority. One of the first things that we have, and this is really the first thing that establishes the idea of limited government within society, and this is passed in 1215. And this document, which was signed by King John, limited the king's power, in which he agreed to consult nobles before he made political decisions, especially having to do with taxes. So we really see for the first time where the king had absolute power under the idea of God put me in power to rule. This is the first thing that is put in place to really limit that. Then we have the Petition of Right. And this document helped reestablish laws such as habeas corpus and trial by jury. Habeas corpus is the concept that you have to be informed of the charges that are against you before being put in jail, and trial by jury means that you get a group of people that are going to determine your innocence or guilt within a crime. Now, originally under the Petition of Right, that concept of trial by jury only existed for the nobility, but throughout history that has largely been extended to the rest of the populace. Then we also have something known as the English Bill of Rights. And this document lists rights retained by Parliament, allowing them to take control of some of the king's power. So once again, we've got a further limitation of what the king does and the power that he has. And then we also have common law, which we just talked about on the previous slide, and we've talked about it in the previous unit. But common law, remember, is a legal system based upon local custom and precedent rather than legal codes. So they've taken court decisions that have been made throughout the years and throughout the centuries in England, and the way that these things have changed and moved based upon society largely shapes the way that laws are enforced throughout the country. So political traditions. Political traditions are drawn from a variety of sources, and these include the shaping of the monarchy. The monarchy has gradually devolved from an all-powerful monarchy to a figurehead with the role of head of state. So when we look at what the Queen of England currently does now, is she really has little to no power. It's very much a ceremonial concept. She meets with other heads of state. She knights people. She gets to live in a fancy palace. But when we look at the actual power of the Queen of England, there's not very much. Now, they do have power in non-official forms in which they can talk to other people and they can use their position for influence and trying to bring kind of a light to certain issues, but they really don't have any governmental power. So with that, as the monarchy lost power, something had to step up and fill that power vacuum. And what we have that filled that vacuum is Parliament. Now, Parliament has survived throughout revolution. They've survived through time. They have survived from the king being able to dissolve Parliament really whenever they felt like it through a large part of British history. And one of the things that really has allowed them to keep that power is that Parliament has what we refer to as the power of the purse. That even when kings had a lot more power, it was hard for them to do a lot of the things that they wanted to unless Parliament was willing to grant them the money to be able to do those things. We also have challenges to the Industrial Revolution. This is another political tradition that Great Britain has had to deal with. So we have the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, which brought great wealth. And this is what, even though the colonies and things like that existed before, this really propels the British to being able to have a lot of power throughout the world. And it really shapes how a lot of the world is developed. Because when Great Britain largely established many of their colonies, rather than establishing those colonies as an extension of home, they established those colonies as a way of mining resources. All right, so they're able to gain a lot of stuff. They don't provide a lot of infrastructure. They don't provide government control. They don't provide the ability to teach people how to rule themselves. But really what they do is they go in and they take the resources that they want, and then they send them home into their factories so that merchants can sell goods, that businesses can make money, so that factory jobs can be supported. And these are the people that eventually have a say with what's going on in the government. So a lot of this Industrial Revolution, like we said, leads to this colonial concept. All right? And they control a huge part of the world for a very long time. That is why the saying that the sun never set on the British Empire exists, because they literally own something throughout the entire world. All right? Britain gradually loses their colonial claims, though, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So 17 and 1800s, even into some of the early 1900s, or the 20th century, to where they start to lose a lot of that power throughout the world. With them losing that power and with them having the influence that they've got during World War II, England's kind of status as a world power has definitely waned over the last century or so. In the mid-20th century, Britain became a welfare state. So after World War II, they become a welfare state that was eventually curtailed in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher. And what we mean by them being a welfare state is that they definitely push more towards that socialistic side of government. There's a lot more things that the government do as far as providing people unemployment, providing people with food stamps, providing people with lots of different government benefits. All right, so that has very much stopped under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher is Prime Minister. This concept of getting rid of the welfare state under Thatcher is known as Thatcherism. And that's something that you definitely want to focus on, because we're going to talk about that quite a bit throughout the semester when we look at different things under Great Britain. So you definitely want to make sure that you pay attention to that concept of Thatcherism. The current political power in Britain is divided, as the Parliament is currently run by a coalition government. And what a coalition government is that it is when one of the three main parties within the British government does not contain a majority of seats within Parliament. So in order for that government to function, what they had to do is the majority party has to form a bond with one of the other parties in order to be able to do that. So currently, right now, as of August of 2014, the government is run by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So when we look at the political culture of Great Britain, they have a very well-developed political culture in Britain. Britain is very nationalistic. People that live in England are very proud of the fact that they're from there. All right. Britain also reflects the concept of insularity, or a feeling of separation from the continent of Europe. They're a little island, So they're not necessarily embroiled in a lot of things that the rest of Europe gets embroiled. It gives them an ability to be a little bit distant from the different things that are going on. This insularity has led to them being very cautious to their involvement in the EU. So even though they are legally part of the EU, there are certain things that they've done to kind of separate themselves and remain a little bit more independent than a lot of the other EU countries have done. And one of the main things with that is that they have chosen to retain their use of the pound rather than using the euro. And one of the main reasons why they chose to keep the pound and keep their economic system a little bit more independent than they would have if they had adopted the euro is because they very much don't want to be tied to some of these lower level countries that have recently been allowed into the EU. They don't want their economy to be kind of pulled down by other countries like Greece, who's in major economic issues, or other countries like that. All right, one of the things that we also have to understand about political culture in England is this idea that we refer to as noblesse oblige. All right, and traditionally, this is traditionally practiced by the more traditional parts of the Conservative Party. This refers to the practice of upper classes taking responsibility for the welfare of the lower classes. Historically, this is rooted in the idea of the nobility needing to make sure that they took care of the peasants. And this is something that is very much ingrained in the social consciousness of England, and it's one of the reasons why the welfare state became so popular in the 20th century, because there is this very strong idea that people need to be taken care of within that country. All right. England is largely culturally homogenous, but there has been an influx of more ethnic minorities and things like that into England over the years. So even with them being culturally homogenous, being largely white, being largely Protestant, there are some differences because you've got the English, the Scottish, people from Wales, and the Irish that are all part of Great Britain. So there is a little bit of conflict there, and within that history, all of those different places have different kind of an independent concept in their history. So there's some tension there that we'll see as we look at the history of England. And we also see conflicts between Protestant and Catholic, Protestantism and Catholicism, which is why we have a split between Ireland and Northern Ireland. All right, British citizens are generally willing to obey the law. You don't see a lot of conflict within England as far as what's going on with the government. You don't see a lot of conflict of people wanting to change regimes or anything like that. Britain has one of the smallest police forces amongst democratic nations, which shows you how peaceful and calm things are within that nation. All right, there is a growing Muslim population in Britain as well, which has caused some issues in the post-9/11 world. So there are different things that are going on. They are becoming less homogenous culturally, but for the most part, England is pretty unified based upon their cultural concepts.